In this program, we'll be discussing the disappearance of arable land, the problem of drinking water, and food supplies. At present, these problems are the most glaring in third world countries, but they concern the whole planet. We can no longer ignore the fact that while the third world lives in poverty, it is by no means poor. It has petroleum and uranium, considerable mineral resources, and in terms of agriculture, it is still the main supplier of precious goods such as coffee, chocolate, rubber, tea. Unfortunately, this wealth is often sold to rich countries for a nominal fee. One of the third world's less-known treasures is bamboo. Bamboo can be found everywhere in the Orient. It has incredible vitality. It multiplies quickly by its roots, a rhizome which spreads underground and creates new shoots. Bamboo is the poor man's wood, but it alone cannot save the planet from the dangers of deforestation gone haywire. For several years now, increasingly extensive areas of the third world have been stricken with drought. Crops burnt by the sun are insufficient. Whole populations are forced to emigrate to more fertile lands. Relentlessly, the desert advances. And yet, vegetation used to cover most of these deserts. According to scientists, the growth of deserts in many parts of the world cannot be explained by climatic change alone. It is primarily due to uncontrolled deforestation. In the third world, wood is an indispensable raw material. 2/3 of the population in developing countries depends on wood as a source of energy. It is used to cook food. It is also used as fuel for industries, such as the food industry. However, as the population in the third world is rapidly increasing, tropical forests are being overexploited. The destruction of these complex natural systems is causing severe ecological imbalance. The soil in tropical regions is more vulnerable to lumbering than in temperate regions. The greater part of the nutritive elements in tropical forests are stored in the trunks and foliage of the trees. When plant debris decomposes, the nutrients it contains are immediately picked up again by the tree roots and are therefore constantly recycled. However, when trees are cut, a large portion of the nutritive elements of a forest are lost. The rain drags the few remaining surface nutrients deep into the ground. In a few years, the ground becomes completely sterile. Moreover, the roots of the trees cease to retain water and to protect the fertile layer of topsoil against wind and runoff. When forests are slashed, soil is left exposed and will erode at an accelerated rate. Millions of tons of arable land are thus lost every year. In turn, ecological imbalances create economic disasters. Deprived of wood to cook their food, families are forced to walk kilometers to find some. They often have to burn manure or crop leftovers, which robs the soil of fertilizers, impoverishing it even further. A number of scientists are trying to develop methods to counter the dramatic effects of deforestation. Better isolated fireplaces with more effective air inlets will considerably reduce the consumption of wood. The improved fireplaces may help solve the energy crisis half of the world's population is faced with. Still, the main cause of deforestation remains the use of land for agricultural purposes. Intensive farming quickly saps the soil, and animals eat what's left of the growth. One way of forestalling deforestation and desert propagation would be to reconcile agriculture and reforestation. Researchers have found a way to do that through a technique known as agroforestry. The technique is based on leguminous trees that are able to grow in poor soil and enrich it at the same time. These trees can in turn promote the cultivation of food-producing plants such as corn. Leguminous trees could be compared to natural fertilizer factories. At their roots are colonies of nitrogen-fixative bacteria. The bacteria have the property of picking up the nitrogen in the air and converting it into nutrient compounds trees can assimilate. Part of these nitrogenous compounds go back to the soil to be used by food-producing plants. In addition, the tree's foliage constitutes nutritious fodder for domestic animals. Agroforestry has proved effective in strip farming. Strip farming consists of alternating hedges of leguminous trees and food-producing plants. The trees are pruned and the cut branches laid on the ground, where they provide the seedlings with the nitrogen they need for sustained growth. The trees grow very quickly, so several crops are possible. Strip farming is particularly useful on hillsides, where the trees protect the soil from erosion and retain the water the plants need to grow. Thanks to agroforestry, people in the Third World can learn to curtail the spread of deserts and provide food for themselves at the same time. If we can implement these techniques quickly, perhaps we may be able to stop all of the world's tropical regions from becoming deserts. Desertification is a problem all countries will have to grapple with, and this applies to drinking water as well. If you've already been to tropical countries, you may have come home with a case of the turista. It's almost inevitable. We know we should avoid drinking the water, eating freshly washed fruits and vegetables. You can't be too careful. All it takes is a scotch on the rocks for you to get a painful and tenacious case of diarrhea. This is the famous turista. The turista is relatively benign, but in some regions of the world, water can be the source of far more serious contamination. While most of the water on the planet is salt water, the reserves of fresh water are amply sufficient to sustain the Earth's growing population. Even a tiny fraction of the water available would be enough to satisfy the needs of all mankind. And yet, half the population of the planet does not have fresh drinking water. Water shortages are particularly glaring in the Third World, where supply systems are virtually non-existent. Women and children in such areas have to walk for hours every day to get the water for family needs. During the dry season, looking for water and carrying it home is their main activity. But in the Third World, water is not only hard to find, it is also often contaminated by harmful bacteria from feces. That contamination is the cause of one of the most severe health problems on the planet today. The contamination of water by feces is usually discovered through the presence of bacteria called fecal coliforms. While they're not necessarily pathogenic in themselves, the fecal coliforms may cohabit with pathogenic microorganisms. Feces constitute an environment conducive to the development of pathogenic microorganisms. Fecal coliforms generally indicate the presence of these harmful microorganisms. To determine the microbiological quality of water, a precise amount is poured through a filter with pores small enough to retain the bacteria. The filter is then placed in a culture medium that promotes the growth of fecal coliforms. Each coliform retained on the filter quickly divides. In 24 hours, its descendants form a very visible colony, indicating the number of fecal coliforms in the sample. To meet international standards, drinking water must be completely free of fecal coliforms. In many third world regions, however, these standards are certainly not met. Without adequate sanitary facilities, fecal matter is often disposed of near water people consume. The microorganisms resulting from feces spread throughout the expanse of water. When it is collected for consumption, the contamination runs a veritable cycle through the entire community. Lack of hygiene is also a frequent cause of contamination. In rich countries, hygiene is part of our regular habits. But that is not true in developing countries where people largely ignore what causes diseases and how they are transmitted. Consequently, because of the inadequacies in terms of hygiene control, whole families are often infected. They become beds of infections. Result: millions of people are stricken by serious illnesses such as cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, poliomyelitis, and hepatitis. One of the worst consequences of these diseases is diarrhea. Acute diarrhea will quickly lead to dehydration. It may become chronic and entail malnutrition and death. Diarrhea usually spares healthy adults whose immune system has created antibodies against the microorganisms' repeated assaults. But diarrhea severely strikes young children and old people whose immune systems are less effective. However, there are ways to combat these diseases. One of them is oral rehydration. Oral rehydration consists of giving patients a solution composed of glucose, non-polluted water, and mineral salts. The solution restores the appetite and helps to replenish the water lost. A mother will then be told she can continue to breastfeed her baby. Breast milk helps to develop antibodies that will protect the baby against infection. However, oral rehydration does not constitute in itself a solution to the problems of the fecal contamination of water. To solve it, communities at grips with the problem must undertake a series of measures. With some necessary assistance, they can improve their sanitary facilities, for instance, by building concrete wells that are equipped with a hand pump. These wells are covered to protect the water from contamination better than open wells. The families may also be encouraged to be more hygienic in their habits, for example, to wash their hands with soap or ash. Such methods may seem simple, but before they become common practice, a major education effort must be undertaken. Whether water is purified to free it of coliform bacteria or of toxic wastes poured into it by industrial polluters, it comes down to the same concern. Throughout the world, drinking water is one of our greatest resources, and we should do everything we can to protect it. But another problem faces third world countries, and that is food security. Agriculture must be able to develop locally and to benefit from the latest technology available. It's the only way to protect third world countries from hunger and to spare them the charity of the Western world. While the population of developed nations is now stationary, in developing countries it is increasing at an alarming rate. Experts predict that by the year 2000, more than 6 billion men and women will have to share Earth's limited resources. 5 billion of them will be living in third world countries. Food production will have to be substantially increased to sustain such phenomenal growth. Our planet has only so much land that can be cultivated. Even now, that land does not provide sufficient food for third world populations. However, many scientists believe that developing countries could increase their agricultural production. For example, researchers are seeking to genetically improve nutritive plants in the third world, so they'll be able to increase their yields. The cowpea is one such species, mostly grown by small farmers in the dry regions of Africa. The cowpea is a major source of protein. Inexpensive and of good quality, cowpea protein is a staple in many African communities. There is a growing demand for cowpeas on African markets. The researchers are therefore attempting to create superior varieties to better meet the needs of the people. They are working from strains of seeds from more than 7,000 varieties of cowpea. Every variety has its positive qualities, such as large-sized seeds, rapid growth, or a high resistance to insects or disease. The genetic improvement consists of crossbreeding the best varieties. The experiments are conducted in a hothouse with screens to keep out pollinating insects. This precaution ensures better control over the pollinating process. The pollen from one plant is collected and transferred to a female organ or stigma of another plant. The crossbreeding produces hybrids, which often combine the features of the two mother plants. Researchers can thus obtain plants that are more productive, more resistant to insects and diseases, and that grow faster than their predecessors. Later, each new variety is subjected to tests. It is exposed to insect attacks. It is also inoculated with pathogenic organisms cultivated from diseased plants. Once sorted and selected, the more resistant varieties are sent throughout Africa to assess their adaptability to the main agricultural areas on the continent. These experiments have already proven successful. The quality of some new varieties of cowpea yield crops 10 times superior to traditional varieties. And their resistance to pests and disease reduces the need for pesticides and fertilizers, which are very costly for small farmers. Another way to meet the challenge of food security in the third world is to upgrade the old agricultural ways practiced for generations. For instance, through research, farmers in the dry regions of Sri Lanka are now able to considerably increase their rice production. For centuries, the farmers had been growing rice using irrigation systems linked to huge reservoirs. The reservoirs would be almost empty during the dry season, but the rain season replenishes them every year between October and January. Following the rainy period, when the reservoirs are full, the farmers open the gates. Then they irrigate the land and sow the rice. In a few months, the rice reaches maturity and can be harvested. With this traditional system, until recently, the farmers only produced one crop a year. The researchers taught them how to double their rice crop. They did this by introducing new varieties of rice. On top of producing greater yields, the new varieties mature faster than the old ones. The researchers proved that unlike the traditional varieties of rice, the new ones could be sowed at the beginning of the rain season, in October, and be harvested right after it, in January. So while the rice is growing, the reservoir can be irrigating the rice land for a second crop. Thanks to the combined use of new varieties and a better cultivation method, the farmers are now able to harvest 2 rice crops every year. Thanks to new varieties of plants and better adapted farming techniques, there is hope that we will someday manage to solve the hunger problem in our world. There remains, however, a great deal to be done before these simple technologies become common practice in third world countries. 40% of the world's population consumes 70% of total food production. The planet will never be able to tolerate the whole world consuming and destroying as frenetically as the Western world is now. As the Dutch proverb says, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children.